Thanks for inviting me and letting me present our early work on who sells cryptocurrency. So this is co-authored work with Jeff Hoops at UNC and Jaron Wild, who is also here at Iowa. We worked on a little bit and kind of love some feedback. I think there's a question chat at the end, but if you have questions kind of in the middle, I don't know, Near and Dingwei, if you can see the chat and just kind of call them out, I'm fine answering stuff as we go through it. Otherwise, I'm just going to jump into the presentation and get going. So the first thing I have to do, because we have IRS data, we've been using IRS resources, all the data work involving this project with the administrative tax data was done on IRS computers by IRS employees, and the views expressed here are those of us authors alone and do not reflect the views of the Internal Revenue Service. So getting into that, what am I actually going to talk about, right? What are my views? The first thing I want to go over is what cryptocurrencies are we actually looking at, right? There's a lot of them. What do we actually study? Why are we looking at these in the first place, right? Why should we care? And ultimately, right, go over our results. The interesting part of our paper, who do we find is actually selling and reporting cryptocurrencies to the IRS? So we kind of take a limited approach, and I'll go over exactly how we identify stuff a little bit later, but we're really looking at Bitcoin and Ethereum. Our sample period starts in 2013. We're currently in the process of collecting data for 2021. But really, back in 2013, you had Bitcoin, and that's about it. So we keep Bitcoin and Ethereum as kind of the largest cryptocurrencies. We think that's, people are reporting those. They're probably also reporting their other lesser coins, the smaller cap coins and that stuff. So we think that this is kind of representative of what people are reporting and what people own cryptocurrencies. We also have quite a bit of survey evidence saying that, most people own Bitcoin or Ethereum in addition to their other coins. So again, we think this is pretty representative. We've done some work looking at, some of the other coins, and they just end up getting really hard to identify from the data that we actually have. So why do we care who owns cryptocurrency? So I think this is a question that we as authors have thought about a lot. And, ultimately we have SEC, the former SEC chairman saying, the priority of the SEC is protecting and serving Main Street investors. And so we think a lot of people who are owning cryptocurrency are these Main Street investors that, regulation and enforcement is trying to protect. And why does the SEC need to engage in these enforcement actions that they have been very, very recently, really stepping up this enforcement along with the CFTC? This is probably my favorite fortune cookie because I think, when you start getting investment advice from a fortune cookie, that's when you probably want to think twice about what you're doing. And, the looking ahead in retrospect, it was inevitable on the FTX branded fortune cookie. I think is a little bit, crazy to think that happened, but they could have more than 1 million bankruptcy claims, right? We're constantly getting updates from their bankruptcy stuff because John Ray has been pretty public about the whole process. And that's a lot of people who lost money, right? And it's not just the big institutional investors. It's, again, those kind of Main Street investors. We had Gemini and Genesis going through some bankruptcy claims as well. A lot of frozen investor accounts. Going back a little bit farther, we had the Terra Luna collapse. Again, a lot of people losing money. And I think one of the biggest things here for me is the Mango Markets hack really tells me, all right, how is this different than what we think of traditional stocks or traditional investments, right? And that's the Mango Markets hack was a normal hack, right? Somebody stole a bunch of money. So we've seen that before, but you actually had the hacker go out on Twitter and say, hey, I was involved with a team that engaged in this highly profitable trading strategy, right? They didn't see it as illegal when they did it. They didn't see it as a hack. They just thought, hey, no, this is something, code is law. This is what we're going to do, and it's going to make us a bunch of money. And then ultimately, right, they're indicted by the CFTC a little while back, but there is a different perception in cryptocurrency and in the cryptocurrency community that, if, as an uninformed investor, we do have to take and consider that, some people are potentially acting in bad faith in a way that is going to cause more harm, both to the community and to investors themselves. Ultimately, like I mentioned before, government is taking action, right? We had Biden's executive order last year. The SEC and the CFTC have really been engaging in a lot of action, kind of regulation through enforcement, which maybe isn't the best way, but they are taking action. And, internationally, we've seen the EU and other countries adopting new regulations, new laws, kind of deal with this entirely new asset class that we have. So ultimately, let's get into the meat of it. How do we identify our cryptocurrency transactions? So we have IRS data, we have taxpayer data that we are able to examine and kind of use to identify transactions. So now these circles are not to scale, but we have kind of in the bottom corner, non-reported IRS transactions. So these we can't see, right? If you don't report your transactions to the IRS, we don't have you in our data sample for cryptocurrency users. Obviously, this cuts out a lot of people who are doing illegal stuff, right? If you're buying or selling illegal goods, maybe you're not going to go and report those transactions as taxable on your tax return. But we think that the majority of individuals, especially those who are transacting through, the Robinhoods and the Coinbases and are getting kind of tax reports from those exchanges, they're probably pretty likely to report their transactions. We know from prior research that if there is third-party reporting, so Robinhood sends out a 1099, that people are just pretty likely to report that, put that into their tax software, TurboTax, whatever it is, and then that'll go in. So we have a lot of reported cryptocurrency transactions. Then we limit ourselves to individual transactions. So we're not looking at businesses here. We're not looking at if you own it through an investment partnership or the Coinbases, Tesla's stock holdings, right? We're not looking at those. We're just looking at the individual investors. And then I like to kind of split, what we think about cryptocurrency into three groups. So the first is non-exchange transactions. So those are going to be, your on-chain transactions, maybe your decentralized finance, anything that you're transacting that you can see on the blockchain generally. Then we have exchange transactions. Now, some of these can be on-chain, but you're going to be going through some sort of centralized exchange. There might be third-party reporting. And finally, we have indirect transactions. So those are going to be, hey, I bought Tesla stock because I know Tesla owns a lot of cryptocurrency and I want exposure kind of indirectly. Or maybe you buy Bitcoin futures on the commodities exchange. So prior research has kind of looked more so at these indirect transactions because we already have a lot of data on them, but they're also highly regulated. So we have reporting, they're treated just like stocks that we know of, or just like other financial instruments that we know of. And so what we really focus on first is our Bitcoin and Ethereum within these three, but then really on these non-exchange and exchange transactions. So we actually, in our kind of search for cryptocurrency transactions, we try to exclude the indirect transactions. Now, we haven't done work yet, but we are kind of in the process of running some more data to look at these indirect transactions and see if there are differences between individuals who, maybe they just feel more comfortable owning cryptocurrency through an already regulated security versus those who are using the Coinbases or on-chain transactions, and kind of tease out differences that there might be between the users between the two groups. But our data right now just looks at kind of these non-exchange and cryptocurrency exchange transactions.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
So can you say something about how the IRS kind of see, or in general in USA, what is the regulation about non-exchange transaction? Because I know from Israel, for example, that when you use Robinhood, Coinbase, whatever. So given that everything is documented, so there is less like worry about illegal transaction. But when you do something that is on chain, so even that you report it to the IRS, so there is the issue of like how you get the Bitcoin, which guys you trade with on chain, what you did, like, you know, once you trade in decentralized exchange platform, it's very like black box, what's happened there. So do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, so I guess, one, I don't know exactly what the IRS thought process is. So this is kind of my general experience, as a practitioner when I was a practicing CPA doing accounting for taxes. I actually did some cryptocurrency returns. So what I was thinking about then, what I know about the IRS system, I'll say from a tax reporting standpoint, right, they're generally treated the same, right? The gains are calculated the same way, the losses should be calculated the same way. I think right, from the IRS's perspective, they just care that you're reporting it. Now, the opposite side of that is a lot of times when we see fraud prosecutions or criminal prosecutions, right, a lot of that comes from non-reported taxable income, right? So the case that everyone goes to is Al Capone, right? Notorious gang leader. Ultimately, what was he charged with and indicted for? It was tax avoidance, right? For not reporting these things. So there's certainly, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, is definitely paying attention. They're definitely working with other agencies. You can see in their yearly reports that they put out. I think I just saw an article just the other day about how, the IRS criminal enforcement was looking at money laundering and identifying cryptocurrency transactions. And so to me, I think if you're reporting it, that kind of criminal side is probably pretty separate. But if you're not reporting it and they audit you and they find out, then maybe that leads to the criminal side if they think you're doing something. But I think from the tax return perspective, the IRS just really cares whether you're reporting the correct amount of income or not. They don't really make a distinction between a completely on blockchain anonymized transaction and one that's, reported to you via 1099. If that answers your question.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
So ultimately, who are they? And this graph might actually give you a little bit more information kind of in that process as well. So ultimately, we end up with over 2 million unique cryptocurrency tax returns. Now, these are not necessarily individuals that you can married filing jointly. So, we don't try to say, okay, it is the husband or the wife. We say it's tax returns, right? The average cryptocurrency gains on a yearly basis is about $12,000. The median is only $27,000. And there's some noise in these figures a little bit because of how we have to do IRS data. So the median isn't quite the true median, but it's really highly skewed, right? You have a lot of people making very small, gains and losses, and then you have some enormously large gains and some really, really large losses. But on average, pretty small. And you can see on the side here, we have, cryptocurrency sellers over time is the yellow line, basically exponentially increasing since 2017. So, that was when Bitcoin really first gave that first pop up to $20,000. It was all over the news. So we expect a lot more people coming in. That's also around the time when the IRS was talking more about cryptocurrency and issuing the regulations and stuff. So there's more enforcement going on at the same time. That's when they did the Coinbase John Doe summons. And so you've seen, just an increase since then. And really, I think one of the big telling things is you've also seen a pretty large increase in the number of third-party reporting. So the black bars are the percentage of cryptocurrency returns that receive a 1099B, so a third-party reported transaction on their 1099Bs, which people are just much more likely to report. So we can see, in general, that has been really going up as more companies are actually issuing these 1099s. And if you get a 1099, you're much more likely to report it. I do see a question.
Yep, we have a Q&A.
So Mariah, I have a question regarding these stats. These are reported gains. From your experience as CPA, how different is this number maybe from the real level? So yeah, so that is an issue with IRS. Anytime we use IRS data, right? We don't have unreported gains. What I would say is that in general, especially if you're using a CPA, so if you have kind of on the very large end, a lot invested, those individuals are not going to want to avoid taxes, right? They're going to ask you for all your information. And so when I was doing taxes, right, we reported everything. And I think if you are reporting something, it is probably everything. You're not saying, oh, I'm going to report these cryptocurrency gains, but I'm not going to report these other cryptocurrency gains. You're just going to report everything. There is always going to be a section of the population that will say, hey, I didn't get a 1099, and so I don't have to report it, or I don't want to report my cryptocurrency gains. And we can't speak to them, unfortunately. That is one of the limitations of the data. But I think, given that you are reporting, I would say the averages are pretty good in fact, as so far as like what's the average gain of somebody who does report their cryptocurrency transactions. We obviously also have some noise in our measure of identifying cryptocurrency transactions, right? If you try to kind of obfuscate it and say, some really weird description or some summarized transactions, sometimes we don't see those. So definitely, there's going to be noise in our measure, but I think right now it's the best available estimate that we kind of have out there on this many unique taxpayers that we have. All right, so getting into a little bit of, who are these people that report cryptocurrency? So we thought, well, what, other information from tax returns can we kind of look at and identify to see how cryptocurrency sellers are different? So the earned income tax credit, we usually think of as low income individuals, right? You have to be under certain income thresholds. And we see, obviously, we split this out between non-investors. So these are people that don't have capital gains, don't have stock sales, don't have dividends. So they, as close as we can get, don't have a lot of money invested. We see they're the most likely to claim the EICT tax credit. And that makes sense, right? If you don't have money invested, you're more likely to, qualify under these income requirements. Investors, pretty low. And so these are the orange is investors that do not have cryptocurrency. And then the yellow is investors that do have cryptocurrency. And so this shows us, as our other stats show, cryptocurrency investors generally have lower incomes than other investors, and they're more likely to be in this kind of low income tax bracket to claim these low income tax credits. We also look at gamblers. And so this was a result that actually kind of surprised me a little bit, because I was expecting, hey, cryptocurrency, especially in the pandemic 2019, like, oh, this is just gambling. We're going to, we're investing in GameStop. We're also going to invest in cryptocurrency, and we're also going to be gambling. We don't see a huge difference between gambling winnings and cryptocurrency ownership or investor ownership in general. And then similar, we think of cryptocurrency as younger people. They're much more likely to be students and I think a little bit, although we don't have direct evidence of this, but, more likely to be higher educated. And then ultimately, again, getting at that income, right? They're more likely to have debt canceled. Another sign of being low income, being in kind of a financially worse position if you have debt that's canceled and because you can't pay it off.
So, sorry, would you remind us what the y-axis is?
The y-axis is the percentage of returns.
So within the group or?
Within the group.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Then, over time, and I think this is one thing where we in academia, haven't been as good because data to a certain extent has been limited on cryptocurrency, but there are major changes happening in cryptocurrency and cryptocurrency investors. that really, again, that 2016 to 2017 timeline is when I would say there's a big shift. And before that, right, we see the cryptocurrency age, investor age, used to be higher in the early period of the people who were reporting, always lower than the non-cryptocurrency investor age, but that gap gets even larger after 2016. And then one of the most interesting things is in the early period, we really saw, wealthy individuals who were reporting their cryptocurrency. And I think this gets a little bit to Mariah's point about who's not reporting, right? We know, it seems like reporting is better. There's more 1099s in the later period. And we really see a decrease in the average income to the point of where, the average cryptocurrency investor is actually making less money than the non-cryptocurrency investor ultimately. So, we talk about kind of this democratization of finance type of idea. And we do, in fact, see that in the most recent period where you have relatively, not as wealthy people investing in cryptocurrency and kind of selling. Then,
Can I ask a question?
yeah.
So I guess you have little bit COVID data, right? You have 1 year. Do you know?
Yes. Yeah.
There was a big discussion about that when the people got the COVID relief, most of the money the students invest in Robinhood and cryptocurrency, whatever. Do you observe it in the data or?
So we cannot observe, right? We only have when people sell. So that is another limitation, right? There is actually another paper. I'm going to forget the authors, but there is actually an academic study that looks specifically at the COVID relief checks using kind of public exchange data. And they do, in fact, find that around the times when we think people are getting their stimulus checks, we see purchases of cryptocurrency in the exact amount of those checks. So if you got $1,200, we see purchases for $1,200. So I think there's definitely is evidence that, the stimulus checks did increase the number of people, or at least people were using them to buy cryptocurrency, whether they had it before already or not. I think is still open, but other research has definitely looked at that question. Yes.
I see. Okay, cool.
So then this is one of our newer tests, and there's a lot of news articles about, kind of this rags to riches story about people who, bought Bitcoin or bought cryptocurrency really early, and then they just became millionaires. And so we really wanted to look into and say, okay, if you have, in this case, we just use $1 million of gain in a single year, right? What does your income look like years after that? Because I think, you think about the lottery and you hear stories about, people win the lottery and then they blow all the money on really expensive cars and houses. And in a couple of years, they're bankrupt again. And so is cryptocurrency kind of like winning the lottery? Do people just use the money up and then it's gone? Or does it actually change their lives kind of continuing on into the future? And so we look at 2 years before, we split everybody into quartiles based on their income. And then these, for the people who have the $1 million gain, right, we're looking at their income afterwards. And so as you can expect in the top quartile, the highest income earners, right, in the 2 years before this big gain, they're making over $6 million a year, $7 million a year. And they have this huge gain. So it does really increase their income. But then, by 2 years out, they're back down to where they were. So it didn't really change their specific circumstances as far as we can tell. But the other three, right, are lower income quartiles where people aren't making that much. And specifically quartile 1, right, the poorest people in our sample who had $1 million gain, right, they have the biggest bump up. And all three are still significantly higher in income 2 years after they have this big gain. right? And so that seems to indicate, right, because a gain is a one-year thing, that they're trading more and they're still creating large gains, even 2 years out. And so maybe this is a large positive kind of wealth shock that we can say is truly changing people's lives. So then we move to look at some other characteristics of individuals. So we have location. So where did you file your tax return? Where are you living? And how does that change over time? Again, we're interested kind of in this evolution of cryptocurrency holders. So we see, you know, when we look at the percentage of sellers in a particular city, you know, it's East Coast, West Coast. We have Texas in 2014, but everywhere is on one of the coasts, even up to 2020. And so there is still quite a bit of kind of geographic segregation when it comes to, you know, the percentage of people that are reporting cryptocurrency in a particular city or county. However, given, yeah.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, I have a
Do
question.
you?
This is a great graph to
Yeah,
look at.
no, go ahead. Okay.
Right.
Yeah,
So
Neil?
I have a question. Do you know if it could be also guys that get a salary by cryptocurrencies? Because I remember that I know some very, not a big amount, but some crypto and blockchain companies pay with Bitcoin salary.
Yeah, so that's definitely a possibility. We do kind of look at like, okay, what jobs are people working in? What industries are they in? We do find that cryptocurrency selling is more concentrated in kind of like the information processes, the IT type industries kind of throughout our whole sample period. And so I think that's definitely, I mean, if you're working for Coinbase, the probability that you own cryptocurrency, even without getting paid in it, is probably higher, right? Because if you didn't believe in the technology, if you didn't believe in the currency, cryptocurrency, right, you probably wouldn't want to take a job at a firm whose kind of existence depends on it. And so I think, yeah, as far as we can tell from like what industry people are working in, that's definitely the case. You know, I think it's still a little bit interesting, right? We don't see Chicago, you know, where we have a lot of finance stuff. We don't, you know, there's a lot of tech hubs kind of in the Texas, Austin area. We don't necessarily see that, or Houston. So I think even within areas where you expect, you know, just kind of like wealthier tech hubs to be, it still is East Coast, but it's definitely, or East and West, it's definitely still correlated with kind of your industry. And we do some analysis with that as well later.
And it's also correlated with, I know that some states are counted as more pro Bitcoin, so I don't remember, but I think there was one state that allow you to pay the state taxation with crypto. Do you observe something like that also in the data?
Yeah, so we don't observe anything like that. We do observe some weird things by state. So I think state borders do definitely matter. So these are graphs of kind of the percentage of cryptocurrency sellers over the total number of tax returns in that county, you know, over time. And we can see, you know, 2014, 2016, very few people using it, right? Very few counties actually have enough cryptocurrency sellers to show up. By 2018, we do see it moving kind of throughout the entire country, right? A lot of places are showing up darker. And then by 2020, right, again, you still see the darkest places on the East and West Coast, but we do see Chicago. We do see some of the middle of the country, Texas. You know, a lot of the big cities have a lot more reporters. And I think like one of the weirdest things when I was putting together these graphs and doing this, because I didn't have a lot of expectations, but you might notice, you know, when you look at the 2020 graph, right, a couple states stand out. Now I don't have the lines in here, right? So you can't tell one county in one state between another, but you can clearly see Nevada. You can clearly see West Virginia and New Hampshire. And so, you know, are way less crypto way less cryptocurrency than neighboring states. And I think Nevada really it's right by California. You would think there'd be some spillover at least. And so, what's going on here, right? And so I did Google Trends, and right, Nevada for 2020, when you search for Bitcoin, was the top search, the state with the most searches. West Virginia was actually the lowest. So like West Virginia makes sense. No one's searching for cryptocurrency there. They don't have a lot of sellers. Probably not very many people selling. Nevada did earlier on in our sample period have a little bit more restrictive laws, but I didn't find anything big that changed in 2020, where they weren't super against cryptocurrency. They didn't create some ban or anything, and people were obviously searching for Bitcoin in Nevada. And so this is one of the things that we're kind of thinking about, what could be the cause of this? One interesting suggestion we've got that we will be looking into is, gambling laws by state, because certain states allow online gambling and certain states don't. So I mentioned before, we don't really find an overall, kind of correlation between cryptocurrency and gambling, but maybe, Nevada has a ton of gambling. It's pretty easy to do there if you want to do it. And so, the appeal of, a high risk, really high return investment is maybe just a little bit less. We think of cryptocurrency as also facilitating illegal stuff, but, maybe also, hey, if you're going to do something kind of that you don't want people to know about in Nevada, maybe you use cryptocurrency, and that's going to be correlated with not reporting it as well. So I don't, to me, it's just super interesting to see this. We're looking at it more to kind of figure out, hey, what's going on here? I looked at kind of law changes. Like I said, I didn't see a lot, but there's definitely differences in states. And I think it does kind of at least inform something of, how a state's population is, how a state reacts to cryptocurrency can kind of change the adoption of the new technology. So then we go to occupation. Like Nir kind of mentioned earlier, right? We expect occupation to be pretty correlated with who owns cryptocurrency. And indeed, we see professional, scientific, technical service companies have pretty high stuff, administrative and support services. And then, they stay throughout our whole sample period. But, in the early sample period, maybe makes sense. The securities, financial investment, information services, computer product manufacturing, right? Industries that you would say, okay, these are the more technologically advanced people, right? The West Coast, California businesses, like they were early adopters. And so we saw a high percentage or high raw count compared to other industries. And then over time, and I think this speaks to just the broadening of cryptocurrency's base overall, right? This graph is doing the raw count, so it's just the number. And so, later on by 2020, we see industries that just have a lot of people, right? So food and drink services, trade contractors, food and beverage stores, right? Again, indicating, potentially lower income workers, but just there's way more people working in restaurants than there are working at Facebook or Google. And so we expect way more of them to have cryptocurrency, and that is ultimately what we see. So there is this broader kind of adoption of cryptocurrency over time that we can see in the data. And finally, this is our newest kind of set of tests that isn't actually in the paper version yet. So you guys are getting a little bit of a preview of some of the stuff we've been working on. And we wanted to look at racial disparities, right? So there's a lot in the news about, first, was cryptocurrency gonna bridge the racial wealth gap? Then when it went down kind of recently, there were articles about, oh, is it hurting, minorities worse than other people, right? Increasing the racial wealth gap. The problem is the IRS does not have taxpayer level racial data. You don't collect it. It's not a checkbox or anything on your tax form, so they don't have it. So we have to do a little bit of kind of data manipulation and aggregation here to even answer the question, but I think it is useful. So we use census data. So we do have racial by county and zip code. And then we aggregate the IRS data by the zip code of where the tax return was filed, and we kind of merge it in with our census data. We then standardize all the variables so that, right, all of our coefficients can be interpreted as a change in one standard deviation results in a change in the dependent variable. And, we're going to use this kind of aggregated approach to examine how race plays into cryptocurrency reporting. So the first thing, how many people are selling? So we look at the percentage in a zip code of people that report cryptocurrency. We use census controls for income of this zip code, the age of the population, the education of the population, and then we look at different racial demographics. And so I think, we use 2017 onward just because that's when we have most of the sample. So because we're aggregating over the zip code level, right, we don't want that driven by just one person reported and happened to report in this county. But we see, the higher percentage of Hispanic individuals in the county and Asian in 2017 are associated with more cryptocurrency sales. Well, African Americans for 2017 and 18 were actually less likely to invest, right? And then it wasn't until kind of 2019 and 2020 that we actually see that flip for African Americans to the extent of they are more likely than basically the white population to invest in cryptocurrency by the end of our period in 2020. Hispanics and Asians both increased those percentages as well. So there is increasing kind of minority adoption, at least as far as we can tell. It is entirely possible that there's a lot of Asians, for some reason, all the white people go out and buy cryptocurrency. We can't rule that out, but it does provide some evidence that, there is racial differences in who's using cryptocurrency. But then, that tells us who's selling, tells us who's reporting. It doesn't necessarily tell us, is there an outcome? And so we look at gains, and we don't have the best data on gains just because of how kind of IRS limitations. But with that caveat, we look at, all right, what's the average gain that an individual in that zip code is going to report? And we see it kind of flows in with the, ups and downs of cryptocurrency itself. So I put just as like a baseline, right, the yearly buy and hold Bitcoin return at the bottom. In 2017, we can see, these people who were more likely to invest had larger gains. Even African Americans, I think this was interesting. They were less likely to invest or to have sales in 2017. But given that they had sales, that you see larger increases, larger gains for them. Then 2018, right, as expected, if you're investing more, if you're more exposed to something and it goes down, you have larger losses. So minorities in 2018 and 2019 were actually hurt a little bit more. They seem to have lower gains than the white baseline. And then by 2020, Bitcoin kind of has rebounded again, and we again see these larger gains for minority investors, these zip codes with more minority investors in them. And so I think, I got a picture of Herky the Hawk here at Iowa. But I think the takeaway from our paper, both from the academic community and, hopefully from kind of industry, is there's changes over time in both reporters. And I think we can say, kind of in people who own cryptocurrency are really significantly changing over time, and they continue to change. One of the reasons we're collecting more data on 2021 is because we think, there was some big changes in cryptocurrency in 2021, and we want to see how that affects stuff. So we can't just take this as, oh, cryptocurrency users, cryptocurrency owners are just a monolithic, stable population. It's changing over time, and we're seeing more and more adoption. I'm sure we're seeing people get out. And so we want to keep updating, what our prior is of who owns cryptocurrency. They remain geographically concentrated. despite kind of a greater dispersion over time. And they're very different from the average taxpayer, right? This is not just a random sample of the population. Our cryptocurrency users are very different, not only from, the average taxpayer, but from other investors, right? And so, the policy implications and the protections that we want to think about and how we think about these things is probably different because it's just a different population, right? We want to tailor our regulations to the people that are actually using this and might be the most harmed or the least harmed. Yeah, thank you for having me. And if anybody watching either now or the recorded version wants to reach out, my contact I think is in the link that you had put up near on the website, or you can certainly find me on the Iowa website, and feel free to shoot an email if you have any questions, comments, or want to talk. So